It's a Tuesday morning in late November 2001. You're standing in a sun-drenched plaza in Buenos Aires. You're surrounded by that European-style architecture that makes people call this city the Paris of the South. You are Javier, a 42-year-old architect. You spent 15 years designing the glass-fronted offices that now define the skyline. By every standard that matters, you've made it. You have a wife, 2 daughters in private school, and exactly $42,000 sitting in a savings account at a major international bank. Notice that you aren't holding Argentine pesos, you're holding US dollars. In your mind, you are insulated from the chaos. For a decade, the government has promised that 1 peso equals $1. It's the law of convertibility. It is the bedrock of your life. At first, nothing seems wrong. You stop for an espresso, glancing at a headline about liquidity pressures. It feels like background noise, a problem for politicians, not for an architect with a dollar account. Then, you walk to the ATM on the corner of Cali, Florida. You need to withdraw some cash for a contractor. You insert your card, enter your PIN, and request $300. The machine pauses. There's a low, mechanical whirring sound behind the plastic. And then, a message appears. It doesn't say insufficient funds. It says transaction restricted by government decree. You try again. $100? Denied. $50? Denied. Behind you, the line is starting to grow. People are checking their watches, then their phones. Within 48 hours, the Corralito will be official. Your $42,000 haven't disappeared. Not yet. They are now locked behind a digital wall. You followed every rule the system gave you. And this is the moment you realize the system just changed the locks. Before we look at how a modern economy can just freeze overnight, a quick note. This is a forensic look at history and the patterns of wealth survival. It isn't financial advice. Every crisis is unique, but the way humans respond and the way structures fail usually follows a predictable path. Understanding that path is why we're here. The official history of 2001 tells a story of government overspending and a sudden run on the banks. It's a narrative of collective panic, as if the Argentine people simply woke up one day and lost faith. But that's a convenient simplification. It hides the fact that the trap was actually set 10 years earlier. In 1991, Argentina passed the convertibility law. It was a brilliant, desperate piece of financial engineering designed to kill hyperinflation. The rule was simple. 1 peso was backed by exactly $1 US in the central bank. For a decade it worked. It brought stability, crushed inflation, and made people like Javier believe they were living in a first-world economy. But here's the reality the textbooks often gloss over. You cannot peg your currency to the world's reserve currency if you don't control the printing press. While Argentina was celebrating this dollarized prosperity, it was losing its ability to compete. Because the peso was tied to the dollar, it couldn't be devalued. When Brazil, Argentina's biggest neighbor, devalued its own currency in 1999, Argentine goods suddenly became too expensive for the world to buy. The country began bleeding cash. To keep the one-to-one illusion alive, the government did the only thing it could. It borrowed. They borrowed from the IMF. They borrowed from international bondholders, and eventually, they began quietly dipping into the one place they promised never to touch, the private savings accounts of their own citizens. The Corralito, the freezing of the banks, wasn't a response to a panic. It was the final act of a government that had already spent money that didn't belong to them. By the time Javier stood at that ATM, the one-to-one promise was already a ghost. They didn't lock the banks to protect the people. They locked them because the vaults were already empty. To understand how Javier's $42,000 evaporated, we have to look at the plumbing. Most people believe that when they deposit money, it sits in a vault. We know the bank lends it out, sure. But in Argentina, in 2001, the borrower wasn't a family buying a home. The borrower was a bankrupt state. By late 2001, the Argentine government was starving for liquidity. They couldn't print dollars and no one on the international market would lend to them anymore. So they turned inward. They began pressuring the banks, many of them large household name institutions from Spain and the US, to use their depositors' cash to buy government bonds. Think about that. The bank took Javier's hard-earned dollars and traded them for IOUs from a government that everyone knew was about to default. The smart money saw this coming months in advance. In the summer of 2001, the wealthy elite and the insiders began quietly moving their funds out of the country. This is a pattern we see in almost every modern collapse. The exit is a narrow door, and those closest to it leave first. Between July and November, over $18 billion fled the Argentine banking system. By December 1st, the government realized that if they didn't act, there wouldn't be a single physical dollar left in the country. The decree was called the Corralito, the little yard or playpen. The metaphor was patronizingly clear. The government was putting your money in a playpen for its own protection. You could still use your debit card for electronic transactions, but you could only withdraw 250 pesos per week in physical cash. In a society where the informal economy ran entirely on paper bills, this was a heart attack for small businesses. But the Corralito was just the anesthetic. The real surgery happened a few weeks later. In early 2002, the government officially abandoned the one-to-one peg. They realized that locking the money wasn't enough. They had to reduce the value of what was locked. They introduced a process called Pesification or Pesification. They took Javier's $42,000 and, with a stroke of a pen, converted them into Argentine pesos at a rate of 1:4 to 1. On paper, Javier now had 58,800 pesos. The government told him this was a fair deal, but the moment the peg was broken, the market spoke. The value of the peso didn't stay at 1.4. It plummeted. Within months, it took nearly 4 pesos to buy a single dollar. Let's do the math. Javier's original $42,000 were now worth roughly $15,000 in actual purchasing power. In less than 90 days, without a single stock market crash or a fire, 65% of his life's work had been legally liquidated to pay for the government's debt. Most people think a financial collapse is a sudden explosion. It's not. It's a series of legal maneuvers. It's a change in the definition of a word. One day, a dollar in your account means a dollar. The next day, the government decides that dollar is just a label for a devalued local currency. Javier didn't lose his money because the bank was robbed. He lost it because the bank was turned into a tool of the state. He thought he was a customer. He realized too late he was actually a creditor to a regime that had no intention of paying him back. Understanding the difference between a balance and liquidity is often the only thing that separates those who survive these shifts from those who are buried by them. Most of us don't look at the plumbing of the financial world until the water stops running, but by then the doors are already locked. If you find value in these forensic deep dives into how wealth is actually managed and lost behind the scenes, you're welcome to join us. We look at the patterns the headlines miss, because by the time the news breaks, the opportunity to move has usually passed. In the months following the Pesification, the social fabric of Argentina didn't just tear it reorganized into two distinct realities. For the losers, the millions of people like Javier, the collapse was a slow realization of powerlessness. Javier's middle-class lifestyle was built on the assumption of digital liquidity. He had trusted the numbers on the screen. When those numbers were frozen, he found himself in a barter economy. By mid-2002, nearly 7 million Argentines were participating in Nodos de Trueque barter nodes. These weren't just flea markets, they were entire parallel economies. Imagine an architect like Javier trading his design skills or his household appliances for a bag of flour and a carton of eggs. The professional class was reduced to a pre-industrial state of survival. They hadn't just lost their savings, they had lost the utility of their time. But as the smoke from the burning tires in the streets cleared, a different group emerged. The winners. The winners in a collapse are rarely those who predicted the exact date of the crash. Instead, they are the ones who understand the difference between systemic trust and tangible value. The first group were the expatriated dollars. These were the elite families who had moved their cash into offshore accounts in Miami or Montevideo months earlier. For them, the collapse was actually a wealth multiplication event. When they brought those untouched US dollars back into a devalued Argentina, they could buy prime real estate, factories, and land for 30 cents on the dollar. The collapse didn't destroy wealth, it simply transferred it from the middle class to the ultra-liquid. The second group of winners were those who pivoted to hard assets the moment the Corralito was announced. Since the government still allowed debit card purchases for a short window, savvy individuals went on a desperate shopping spree. They didn't buy luxury goods for status, they bought them as currency hedges. They bought cars, electronics, construction materials, anything with an intrinsic value that would rise as the peso fell. Javier had watched his digital balance turn into dust. Meanwhile, his neighbor, a shopkeeper, who never quite trusted the banks, had spent his last liquid pesos on 4 new Volkswagen Golfs and parked them in a warehouse. 6 months later, those cars were worth 5 times his original investment in peso terms. The divide wasn't between the rich and the poor, it was between those who held claims on the system and those who held the assets themselves. In a collapse, a bank statement is just a promise from a broke institution. A physical asset is a reality that doesn't care what the government calls it. It is easy to look at the graininess of the 2001 news footage, the men in suits banging on the closed metal shutters of banks, and tell ourselves that we live in a different world. We have high-speed apps, instant transfers, and sophisticated central banks, but from a forensic perspective, the Corralito wasn't a failure of technology. It was a failure of permission. In 2001, the government had to physically shut the doors and send police to the ATMs. Today, that same process is frictionless. We have moved from a world of possession to a world of access. Most of us no longer hold money. We hold digital entries in a ledger that we do not control. We see the echoes of the Argentine playpen in modern bail-in laws legislation, now on the books in most developed nations, that allows banks to recapitalize themselves by converting depositor cash into bank equity during a crisis. We saw a version of this in Cyprus in 2013, and we see the soft version of it every time a payment processor or a banking app freezes an account for suspicious activity without a court order. The invisible mechanism today is the push toward a cashless society. In 2001, the Argentine people could at least try to withdraw physical cash to hide under a mattress. In a purely digital economy, there is no mattress. There is only the ledger. If the playpen is digital, you don't even get to see the metal shutters close. Your card simply stops working at the grocery store. The parallel isn't about inflation or currency pegs. It's about the distance between you and your wealth. In 2001, Javier believed the distance was 0 because he could see the bank from his office window. He was wrong. The distance was exactly as wide as the government's desperation. As we move into an era of central bank digital currencies and programmable money, that distance isn't shrinking. It's being codified into the software itself. Today, Javier is 67. He still lives in the same apartment in Buenos Aires, but the glass offices he designed in the 90s are showing their age. If you ask him about the Corralito, he doesn't get angry anymore. He just gets quiet. He eventually got most of his money back, or rather, he got the pesos the government promised him. But by the time the restrictions were lifted, the purchasing power of those savings had been hollowed out. What was once the seed money for his retirement became just enough to buy a mid-range car. The most lasting damage wasn't to his bank account, but to his sense of time. When you realize that 15 years of labor can be redefined by a midnight decree, you stop building for the long term. You stop trusting the architecture of the future. The story of the Corralito is often filed away as a Latin American anomaly, a cautionary tale for unstable nations. But history suggests it is actually a blueprint. Whether it is hyperinflation in the 1920s, bank holidays in the 1930s, or digital freezes in the 2020s, the mechanism remains the same. The system protects itself first and its creditors second. As you go about your week, checking your balances and moving your digital numbers, remember Javier standing at that ATM in the sun-drenched plaza. He did everything right. He followed every rule. He simply forgot that the playpen was never designed to keep him safe. It was designed to keep him in. And in the end, the most dangerous illusion isn't that your money is safe. It's the belief that it's actually yours.